Welcome back, everybody. Today it's just me. We're going to be talking about we're going to review the Portuguese season that just finished, the 2025-2026 Primeira Liga season. That saw Futebol Clube de Porto, or more commonly known as Porto, win the title. Sadly for me, but good news for those who support Porto, obviously. So we're going to be talking about what happened during the season and focus primarily on the big three teams, obviously. I'll likely give my opinion about what exactly I think drove Porto through the finish line. Unlike Sporting and Benfica, we're gonna go through stats, players, and then at the end, I'll drop some notes on some of the coaches that I think I see as up and coming in the Primeira Liga. Probably flying under the radar, but likely will have a shot at some point in a big club, or at least one of the big clubs in Portugal. So I think there's three coaches out there that deserve attention. So without further ado, let's talk about the champions. So Porto won the championship, the Primeira Liga, for the 25-2026 season, and I don't think um, it was. Even though it was a three-horse race towards the end, like you had three teams that were finished off within 8 points of each other, first, second, and third. I don't think there was any doubt that Porto was going to be the champions. I think they had by far the most consistency throughout the season, the most convincing performances, especially against the top teams. I think squad overall, it showed that there was the most quality out of all the teams. Whether individual players themselves were better than their teams, that's questionable. But I think as a whole, the project was successful. And like I think like that is something that is not talked about enough. And I feel that it should. So before we get into stats and everything, what I wanted to show and talk about at least is why I think the project was successful, right? And in particular the Porto season for 2026, right? So if we go back a few years, actually, about 2 years ago, roughly, Porto was in a transition, right? So, what happened is Pinto Costa, who was the president of Porto, who eventually passed away, he lost the elections. So, like Porto, obviously, fans every 4 or 5 years get a say in which president they want, and Pinto da Costa had been the president for Porto for decades. As a matter of fact, he's been president since I was born, more than 30 years ago. So there were a crossroads, and let me remove the banner there just for a second so that we're not, we're not blocking their faces in there. There you go. But basically, the Porto fans decided that it was time for a change. So André Villas-Boas, who some of you may know and remember from the times when he coached together as an assistant manager with Mourinho, and then eventually became the manager for Porto, eventually some stints in England for Spurs and Chelsea, who didn't go particularly well. He's now the president of Porto. And what happened was that he went for elections and he won those elections. He became the Porto president. And with that, he began a new project. And that project went through, I would say, 1 year of transition, which was the last year, 2024, 2025. And it didn't go well, where they basically had at least two coaches that did not work out. So for the 2025-2026 season, which is the season we're talking about, Andre went in and brought an up-and-coming coach who you see on the picture here, Andre Farioli. Farioli had, as the popular terms say, he bottled it with Ajax. I think they only had to have 1 point in the last 5 games and ended up losing all games, if I'm not mistaken, and Ajax ended up losing the title. It was disastrous, to say the least, and he actually got fired. But he has been seen over the last few years as an up-and-coming coach. He has coached and learned. I think he's from the De Zerbi school, so he's worked with him. He's got some experience in Europe, namely in Turkey and Portugal. And the reason why I'm talking about this is because it was a risk, right? Like bringing in a manager who doesn't have, major titles out there, who experienced a downfall, like I said, in Ajax. bringing him in to coach one of the biggest teams in Portugal, there was a risk. However, it was pretty apparent that it wasn't just bringing in a coach and a philosophy; it's about building a project, and that's what Porto did. Farioli came in and really imposed his style of play that we'll talk about, um, and brought in that sturdiness, that discipline that Porto needed as part of a revamp in their projects, right? And what happened was that that discipline was so strong that eventually they built a defensively, sound team that was so consistent throughout the season that got them to first place, right? So I'll talk more about Porto in just a second, but that was like the prelude to the standings. So when um, when I look at the standings here from SofaScore, I have here Porto obviously won with the 88 points, six ahead of Sporting, who was second, and 8 points ahead of Benfica, and they were crowned champions even with 2 games to go. Sorry. Um, and the most apparent thing from the standings is that Porto only conceded 18 goals all season. That is remarkably low. Um, the Over the years, the best defense in the Portuguese league has been conceding more goals. So I actually had to look up the stats here. And like I went all the way back to 2010, sorry. There were seasons in the past where Porto only conceded 13 goals. I think for the newest format, which is 18 teams, those were probably the strongest defenses. Um, but over the years, especially as you can see, starting around 2017, 2018, it went up from the high teens to the mid to low to even high 20s as early as last year, right? When Sporting, who was the best defense at the time, only conceded 27 goals. I can even double check here in the Sofa score just to make sure that I got it right. But yeah, like it was around 27 goals that Sporting conceded, and they were first, right? Porto came along and conceded 10 goals less than Benfica did back in 2023 or even Sporting did in 2024, right? So it was, I wouldn't say it's a break in the cycle or in the what tends to be the trend, but it's just a reflection of how strong they were this year. Um, while teams have consistently conceded more and more goals with time for a variety of reasons that I'm not going to get into, Porto was able to do exactly the opposite. Is with a new coach and a new system, how can you make yourself hard to beat? And that was like, I think, one of the driving factors for them to finish atop of the league, right? On the left side here, I just tabulated the top 3 positions over the years, all the way back to 2019. Porto had finished third in back-to-back seasons with just above 70 points, right? So they went from 70 and 71 points to 88. That's like significant because if you think about it, a 17 points swing in terms of number of wins, that's 5 to 6 wins at the very least, right? And 5 to 6 wins in the Portuguese league um, is usually associated to teams that you play up top. Because for the vast majority of times, the league is so skewed towards the big three, or even you sometimes call it big four if you include Braga. A 5 point swing usually means that you're either collecting more wins against your top opponents or the mid blocks, right? Because you're most guaranteed to win the bottom ones. So the uh, the more games you win against Sporting, Benfica, or at least avoid dropping points against those teams, the higher likelihood are you of getting those 5 to 6 wins. And Porto barely lost any games against their direct opponents. In fact, like I think they pretty much beat everybody or tied, right? And then they achieved enough consistency to win the remaining games of the season, right? Even one of their losses came around after they had already been crowned champions, and I think they conceded 3 goals just in that second last game alone against the bottom team, right? Because that game was worth peanuts. So I think overall the standings from a macro scale are pretty telling. Um, Benfica ended up going without a loss throughout the year, but they had 11 draws, and that's really what held them back. Sporting had as many losses as Porto, but they had a few more draws along the way, right? So we'll talk about their season as well. But overall, like it looks tight, but in reality, it was all about how many games could Porto drop, um, or how many points they could drop along the way compared to everybody else, because it looked like for a long time they were just going to be winning their games, right? So um, I think like the first thoughts would be that again, a new project that started about 2 years ago. This is their second attempt at going it right. They had a new manager to come in, and with that came in all the signings, right? So the if we look at the I'll share my screen here. If we look, one second here, what I'm gonna do. Mhm, yeah, that's gonna be the one, right? Um, Lots of incomings, right? Like for the year, and like that's probably the most impressive part that I find about this Porto team, right? So like a new coach comes in, age 37, and they had a few sells from last year, right? They were able to capitalize on a few players, namely Conceição that left to Juve, a couple of defenders that went out, uh, but nothing else out of the ordinary, right? Like they didn't, other than Conceição that went through, was sold for more than 30 million euros. Everybody else was on the lower side of sales, right? Um, what's impressive to me is that the players that they acquire throughout the year, sorry, at the beginning of the season that play throughout the year, these are players that were slotted in through the starting 11, players that were immediate impact and fit the mold that Farioli wanted to play, right? So Victor Froholt, I'll mention him a few times. He was by far the best player, not just of Porto, but of the entire league. For 20 million euros, again, not a small signing in the Portuguese league. These are high amounts, right? But for the impact and the potential at the age of 19, the 20 million euros today will look like a bargain, in 5, 6 years potentially, right? Alberto Costa that came in and slotted in as the starting right back, Gabri Veiga, Borja Sainz, both who there were more than squad rotation players. They started crucial, important games of the year. Um, and a few younger players, so like Oster Piotrowski, who's extremely talented, who played on the wing, and their center backs Bednarek and Kivior, they came in from England, who were absolutely vital for Farioli's system. So all of these incomings were players that slotted right in the starting 11. They all banked. Like maybe one or two players here per pitch. He barely got any playing time this year. And Luke De Jong obviously was injured at the very beginning, and he's been out for the rest of the season. But everybody else banked, and that is extremely impressive, especially when it's new coach, all new players, all coming at once from different, someone, Gabri used to play in Spain, but he came from the Saudi league. Some players coming in from the Alberto was in Portugal for a while, then left to Italy and came back. Victor, obviously, first time playing abroad. You had all these players coming from all these backgrounds, and yet they fitted the Farioli mold pretty well. And that's like the next thing that I want to talk about. So, what is the Farioli mold? And I've got here two pictures, and it's probably better if I share the picture itself on my screen, because I want to show my mouse over the. Yeah, that's probably going to be better. Yeah. Mhm. Here. All right. So you'll probably be asking, what is the Farioli mold? Right. So Farioli plays in a 4-3-3. Um, Pretty standard. There's a few interesting aspects of it. And what's the most impressive thing is I'm showing you pictures of Farioli's Ajax team at the very top and Farioli's team in Porto at the bottom, right? And there's a few things I wanted to know. So first of all, same system, right? With almost the same formation, if not the same formation. it's identical, right? And there's two things I want to talk about. One of them is the defense, and the other one is the forward line. So Farell's system is very simple. And that's why I think it was very successful, because simple ideas can be adapted by players much better than complex ones. We've seen that with numerous coaches, right, over the years, where they try to overcomplicate things, and then everything just ends up looking like a Campbell's soup, right? So Farioli's system is very simple. You've got two center backs, right? So you show them here, that are comfortable with the ball, right? So whether it was the Ajax center backs or the Porto center backs, Porto had Benarek and Kivior, both experienced, came in from the Premier League, both very comfortable with the ball and relatively, I would say, press resistant, right? So they're very calm and patient, starting the ball possession from the back and progressively moving the ball up the field, right? It's not very energetic, it's not very fast, but it's all about patience. So the two center backs usually hold on to the ball quite for quite a while, and then usually the defensive midfielder comes in to create this triangle in here, and that's usually how they break out the press, or how they start moving the ball around from the back line to the middle, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing about the defense is that the two fullbacks tend to push out wide, right? As soon as they start beating off the press, or they move away from closer to their own box into the midfield. And when they need to, they'll invert. And that's what the top picture, that it shows it a little bit better with these arrows that were drawn over. I borrowed these from the internet, but that's pretty much like the idea here is, as soon as they invert, you have a 2-3-2-3, right? So with a 3 and 2 in the midfield, usually that creates an overload, right? So it tends to crash a lot of the traffic in the middle, and naturally, the opposing teams have to draw in their players, and that's what these wide men here are doing. When you do this, it opens up room for the ball. Like, remember how I said the ball starts and the center backs, they can try and push that ball directly to the winger that's wide up front on both sides. Like you see, you can even see it here, right? Look the opposing forwards or wingers, sorry, or right midfielders, left midfielders for Sporting here are slowly starting to clamp in, and all of a sudden, even if the fullback pushed, you have direct line of pass to skip the midfield and go straight to the wings. And that's what makes it hard, not necessarily to defend against, but to gauge what are they doing. Are they just moving the ball and waiting for us to bite and go and try and press and get the ball back? Or are they just trying to buy time before they can jump the midfield and go straight to the wingers, right? And the forward line is pretty much just doing that. They're just waiting patiently until they get that trigger to either run through the channels or drop back to get that ball. So it's a very simple system. Center backs with ball possession, triangle with the center midfielder here to gauge when exactly they need to move the ball quicker. And then from there, wingers and forwards can run through the channels. Very, very simple. And believe it or not, that, like, I didn't, watch all the footage from Ajax back when he was there, but like when I read some of the articles online, it was pretty much that. There's other things involved, like overlaps, 2-on-1s, but like I think at the end of the day, for those who are less familiar with his system, that's pretty much what it is. And because it's so simple, even though they had injuries along the way, for example, at center back, they didn't always have Kivior because some of their fullbacks were injured. So Kivior had to play left back sometimes. In the winter, they ended up getting Thiago Silva to cover. I think Neuen Perez was like out with an ACL. They still had enough rotation in that team so that spine, the center backs and the center mids, could understand how to move that ball around. And then from there, the rest of the team could adapt. So very simple system. I think, like, I find myself repeating that all the time, but the key is that it's so simple, and yet players bought into it so well, right? Defensively, it's as simple as it gets. So remember, we had the 4-3-3 where the center mid drops to help out with defense. Sorry, in attack. In defense is the same idea. That center midfielder, and I'll probably share it the same way I shared the other one because otherwise you can't see my mouse. That's what happens when you don't do this often. Let me show you here. Mhm. Yeah, there it is. Share screen. The original back line was these two players and these two players here: left fullback, center back, and right back. You got this new player that comes in here. This was the defensive mid. Usually Varela would drop in together with the center backs and for a back five, right? That leaves you with what? That leaves you with your other two midfielders that you had and your three forwards, right? So the two midfielders in the middle remain there, and the two wingers that usually were paired up with the forwards, they drop in to cover the wings. So you have what looks like a 5 and a 4. And then the loner striker usually stays up front here poaching around. So the 4-3-3 becomes a 5-4-1, and the primary goal here is to always close up spaces between the forward line and middle line of the opposing team, but make sure that nobody gets to the middle. At the same time, because they have a line of 5, if they do need to stop oppositions from coming down the flanks, they'll always have at least 3 players that can cover one end. So, for example, left winger and left back are usually supported by an additional center back or one of the midfielders when the ball is on that side, and the same thing goes on the opposite side. Again, very simple. The defensive midfielder drops in between the two center backs, and you've got a line of 5. Um, and like they did this consistently week after week, game after game. The number of games, by the way, that Porto won just one nothing. Like I lost count, but it's probably close to a record. They didn't score too many goals. As a matter of fact, I think they only scored 66, which for a crown champion in the Portuguese league is probably below average. Usually the average is around over 2 goals per game. And this time around, they did just below that, if the math serves me right. Right? Because they scored 66 goals over the space of 66. Right? Yeah, 1.94, just below 2. But they made up for that they made up for it with just not conceding any goals. And usually if you score at least close to or more than 1 goal per game and you concede less than, in every other game, chances are you're going to win those games. And again, when we talked about the 5-6 game swing that gave them the 15-point leap year over year, that pretty much like sums it up, right? So the classic formation, right, that they went with was the 4 at the back to start, right? So, and again, remember all the new signings: Benarek, Kivior playing in the middle, Froholt that came in for 20 million euros, Gavri Vega that came in, um, and Borja Sainz as well, and then Samu that had his second year at Porto, if I'm not mistaken. So, like half of this team brand new. Um, and yet they execute it flawlessly, right? So that Varela, the example you have here from one of their games, I think this was against Sporting, he would typically drop between the two center backs. And then Pepe and Borja Sainz would drop and cover the wings. So overall, that's pretty much how they played. And that's pretty much, I think, what the season went. So when I look at uh, uh, the expectations that Porto had at the beginning of the season versus what ended up happening throughout the season, obviously they achieved more than what everybody expected. Um, but at the same time, that's again Farioli, the simplicity of the approach that he had, the fact that the players brought into it, and that all the players molded like fit the system very well. That's an example of a successful project, something that like the club that I support can't say the same. It just doesn't speak the same language anymore, right? Like this is a successful project. It pains me to say it, but it is what it is. So On to the next team, and we'll talk about Sporting for a little bit now. So, Sporting ended up finishing seconds, um, and it about a year and a half after Amorim left, right? So, actually, why don't we go back to the standings? Yeah, we'll go back to the standings just for a little bit here. For there you go. Um, Having the same losses as Porto and finishing second, just 6 points behind, that's not bad, right? That's not bad. The challenge is that Sporting um, had won back to back titles, right? So the idea was like, can they go in for a third? And um, I think at the start of the year, we all had Sporting probably as the favorite to win it again, given the consistency that they've shown, the quality of football that they were playing, um, as well as like the fact that a lot of the squad had been kept around, or at least like the important players, bar Gyökeres up front, right? So Porto, we already talked about. If we talk about Sporting in particular, Rui Borges remained the coach after taking over last season. Um, lots of sales. So don't get me wrong. Victor Gyökeres made up for at least 2/3 of the incomings or the incoming dollars or euros that came in. But they also sold Conrad Harder, who was supposed to be, I thought, the replacement for Gyökeres, but he wasn't getting enough playing time. And with Suarez being brought in as the new striker, it was pretty apparent that he didn't want to stay anymore. So they ended up recouping a lot of the money. Ezug obviously was sold to Chelsea. Marcus Edwards also left to England. And they had a few other departures. But in terms of sales, they did pretty good. And in terms of incomings, they replaced Gyökeres one to one with Luis Suarez that we'll talk about. They also brought in a second striker, Ioannidis, at almost the same amount, and a few other players. So um, for the that's like Porto. If I were to talk about the Sporting squad, um, the system remained the same. The biggest difference were obviously Gyökeres leaving and being replaced with Luis Suarez, who you're showing up front. He came in from Almeria last year. What's interesting is that Sporting, up until the end of the season, still played the best football in Portugal. Um, some people can debate the opposite, but the with some inconsistency along the way, especially since it was a long season, Sporting was always able to demonstrate that they could um, change up their attack, whether it was attacking through the middle, attacking through the wings, playing direct, playing counter, sitting back when necessary. I think they've been well coached by Rui Borges, and having lost Gyökeres, who was their main guy up front, and replacing him with a guy that was playing almost pretty much in the second league in Spain, it was questionable, right? Especially because they bought him for what I see here, just under 23 million euros, according to Transfer Market. And yet they didn't skip a beat. Suarez ended up being the top scorer in the league. And Francisco Trincão, who you see here in the middle, he's been called up for the Portuguese team. He, had a great season as well. Everybody else, like including the midfield, Hulmans, sorry, and Morita were consistent again. And their back line with injuries here and there, um, they were pretty much consistent as well. The key was that for the league in particular, they just were not as good as Porto, right? Let's keep in mind that Sporting did have a decent run in the Champions League. I believe they finished top 8, if I'm not mistaken. I think. I remember they beat PSG, but they had a deep season because I think they lost to Arsenal in the qualifier. They finished top 8. They actually finished tied in points with Chelsea, Barca, and City. So the Sporting's issue this year was that with the Champions League and with deep runs in the cups that they actually didn't win, I think they run out of steam. But all in all, they demonstrated that even with a change in the striker and couple of departures along the way, they could still compete in all fronts. It's just that they run out of gas. Like that's really what it was. Like I don't want to spend too much time on them, but like that really was what it was. Like that's pretty much it. Cut and dry and simple. There's been questions about Rui Borges in particular. There was a lot of um, fans that were disappointed, especially you know, with the likelihood of them winning a third title in a row. But also, like the Champions League was not necessarily disappointments like that. They overachieved, especially given the teams that they beat and they played against. But the cup, like in the Taça de Portugal, which is the Portuguese cup, Sporting ended up losing to Torriense, who plays in the second division in Portugal. Um, and they lost the final against that team. I believe it was in extra time. So a lot of fans were disappointed and sad. I think there's, uh, I'm not going to speak on behalf of the Sporting fans, but there seems to be two groups: the ones that believe that he's been doing successful, and if he's been successful, and if they bring in new players and if they bring in new signings, and it's just a matter of continuing the good project that Sporting has. It's been a successful project, especially two titles in 3 years. Other ones believe that no, he's just like using up all the good and the quality that was created by Ruben Amorim, and with time that's going to dissipate, especially as the players depart and they leave. Eventually, once he has to rebuild the team, they're not sure whether he's the man to take them there. And Sporting is definitely going to see a lot of changes this year because those two midfielders that I talked about, Morita is out of the club. It's been made official, and Hulmand will likely go to England this summer. If it's not England, it will be Spain or even Italy. But my guess is that he's highly talented. He's probably one of the best center midfielders playing in Portugal. He's shown that he's a good captain, press resistant, box to box. He can do the defensive work, but also show up and score goals if need be. I can see top teams, especially top teams in the Premier League, needing someone like him. I'm looking at teams like Arsenal, for example, if they really wanted. He's definitely an upgrade over Zubimendi. Tottenham Hotspurs, they do need a player that's uh, comfortable with the ball and can move the ball up the field, just to name a few, right? Those are my thoughts on Sporting. Um, and I don't want to spend too much time on them because I want to spend time something else that gives me much more headaches. Where do I even start? Because I want to keep this short. Like this was supposed to be a video about the Portuguese league, but the team that I support, Benfica, is part of it, obviously, and it did not win. And with that, we didn't even finish second; we finished third. And it was a year of events. Like things went by so fast. When I look back since the summer when Benfica participated in the Club World Cup, looking back now, like it's been almost a year, a lot of things have happened. So I'll try to keep it as concise as I can. I'll have dedicated videos to talk about Benfica. Um, so the first things first. Was it a successful season for Benfica? The answer is no. So whoever says, "Oh yeah," because Mourinho came and Benfica ended up going, 0 losses throughout the season. If it wasn't for Mourinho, Benfica would have finished. Stop. Benfica is the biggest club in Portugal. It's the biggest club in terms of fans, biggest club in terms of titles, and biggest, club in terms of coverage, media, money, assets, you name it. So whether it's the most successful team in Portugal, clearly not right now. And I would say over the last 20, 30 years, I think Porto edges Benfica. But in terms of stature, Benfica is the biggest club in Portugal. So for someone to come and say, even Benfica fans to come and say, "Oh, Benfica ended up going without a loss, so we did better than usual." No, it's just not good enough. It doesn't matter who the coach was, doesn't matter who the players were. If Benfica doesn't win a single title, whether it's a cup, whether it's a league, or whether it's even a European title, if there's no titles, it's not a successful season. Those are the bars that were set long time ago by players, as far as Eusebio, um, going back decades and generations. Those were the standards, and those standards must be kept. if we wish for Benfica to still be considered the biggest club in Portugal. That those are the first things I wanted to get out of my system, right? Because like this really pisses me off. The second one is the two people we have here in the picture. So Mourinho and Rui Costa. First things first. Rui Costa, the player, is different from Rui Costa, the president. So for some of you that don't know, just like I talked about André Villas-Boas being the president of Porto, um, Rui Costa is today's Benfica's president. And what was interesting about the beginning of the season was that this was a season where a lot of things could have turned out to be completely different because Benfica was up for elections. So what that means is that club fans and club members in particular um, went ahead and through an election process to pick the new president, and Rui Costa obviously ran for presidency again. So there were many candidates. Obviously, it showed up. Benfica is a big club, a big institution, lots of candidates with some form of funding, and eventually it had to go through two rounds because he didn't win by majority. And Rui Costa ended up winning the elections around October. Why is this important? Let's look back at the summer. So Benfica participated in the Club World Cup in the summer that happened in the US that Chelsea won. Benfica didn't have a normal preseason because the players barely had a break from the previous season. They went on to the road trip, Club World Cup, and then they came back, 1 or 2 weeks break, and then off, next thing you know, they had to start preparing the new season. At the time, Bruno Lage was Benfica's coach, and I'm not going to get into go into details about last season. The season just not the season just happened. The season before, uh, Benfica was not doing good with Bruno Lage. First of all, we didn't win the title last year, right? Like so. Just as a reminder here, in case people forget, Benfica last year in the 2024-25 season finished with 20 points, and the season before that, 23-24, finished with 80 points. Both seasons fell behind Sporting. We won in Roger Smith's first season in 2022-2023 with 87, but the last two we won with 80. We finished second with 80 points. In the summer, Rui Costa, because he's the one running the show, at least I think, given Benfica's ongoing struggles with Bruno Lage at the helm, with, I would say, probably, and still today, I think the strongest squad in the Portuguese league in terms of individual players, individual quality. At the time, Rui Costa had a choice whether, with the World Cup happening, whether you wait until the Club World Cup is done and then you bring in a new coach and with the new players, right? If there was a project, because that's like the biggest question, if that's were to happen. Bruno Lage was not doing well. So then it's like, well, do we start the new season with the same manager? Because we also have to sign players. Benfica also had to sell players as part of preparation for the new season. And what Rui Costa did was he kept Bruno Lage. And this was an important event because Benfica had not qualified for the Champions League yet by the end of the summer. Like, to start the new season, Benfica had to go through the last round of qualification, or the last two rounds. I think they played Nice and then Fenerbahce, who was being trained by Jose Mourinho at the time. So in an interesting turn of events, Benfica ends up beating Fenerbahce and qualify for the Champions League. And that was a 2-game race, and Benfica ended up being, at the time, Fenerbahce that was coached by Jose Mourinho. The season started, and Benfica was not doing well at all. And what Rui Costa decides to do is, and I'm going to paraphrase what he said, but his explanation to the media and to the fans was, it's very early in the season. There's a chance to salvage the season. So I had to make the tough call to part ways with Bruno Lage, and I'll have to bring in a coach that brings back Benfica to where it's supposed to be. So, like, I paraphrase, but his explanation was, I needed to salvage the season. So he brought in Jose. And if I bring it back to the concept of elections, was elections still had to happen in late October. So he brought in Jose, I think it was in September, if I'm not mistaken. Let me just double check this. Yeah. Mourinho took charge in September 2025 with a contract for until 2027. The interesting thing is that Benfica was up for elections in October of that year, October, November. So if Rui Costa had lost those elections, the new president would have brought in the new coach. So whether Jose would have stayed throughout the year or whether he would have been moved on, say during the season or during the winter transfer window, everything was up in the air. And even the fans ourselves, we were wondering, well, like, what's the point of all of this? Like, you had the summer, you had the Club World Cup. The World Cup was just a money grab, it's just an additional source of income, but you weren't going to win that. You had the opportunity to start a new project, whether it's better or worse, doesn't matter. You had the chance to bring in coaches from out there, whether the Portuguese league or from abroad. You chose not to do so. You chose to stick to Bruno Lage at the beginning of the season, and then you part ways with him within a few games, just to bring in Jose, who may stay or may go as early as 2 months. At the time, I'm saying this is crazy, but at the time, it was still crazy. And lo and behold, Benfica's season ended up panning out pretty much the way that anybody who's followed Mourinho and everybody that's followed Mourinho's career turned out to be. So Mourinho came in and brought in stability and discipline. Right, it wasn't necessarily to salvage the season, like Rui Costa said. Um, Benfica is a big club, and Jose understood that since day one. Um, and he knew that the bare minimum is to win titles. It's just that he was aware of the limitations of other things around the club, around the squad, the way it was built, and the way the project is being managed, if you can call it a project. Um, Mourinho was very aware of that. So what he did was, well, let me make sure that I make myself hard to beat. Because even Bruno was not doing that. Um, like for the first couple of games, like Mourinho kept the formation of what Bruno Lage used to play at the time that I'm not going to get into, but slowly, eventually, started putting in his fingerprints, right? So this is pretty much what early in the season it looked like, right? 4-2-3-1 was always like that, right? Um, a lot of incoming players here, especially in the midfield, right? With Enzo Barrenechea and Richard Rios in the midfield, right? Sudakov that came in from Shakhtar to play center mid, Luka Bacchio that came in from Spain, and the two fullbacks like Samuel Dal, who just had returns from, or who actually we Benfica exercised the a clause to buy, and then Dedic that was also acquired through the summer. So uh, he kept the players in there, but he made sure that he only brought in players that he wanted at the right times, right? So eventually, um, as the season progressed, he changed things up a little bit. And unfortunately, when I say a little bit, it's not a lot, right? So here have it later on in the season, um, or how the season ended up panning out was the back line was pretty much the same. The midfield with a few rotations here and there due to injuries or cards was still Enzo and Richard Rios, if not Ausners towards the end. Um, and then Schlerdrup and Prestiani ended up shining on the wings. And that was pretty much, I think, Mourinho's biggest change in the team was how can I inject speed down the wings so that if my team is playing counterattack or a more direct play, I can cause problems on the side, right? Not necessarily playing through the middle, but through the wings. That was the biggest change. But I'm gonna keep it real. If you followed Mourinho and if you followed how Mourinho runs his teams, um, was pretty much that. It was nothing exciting. It was very practical. I know there was a few games in the year, like especially in the Champions League, for example, great wins against Madrid. But there's caveats in those games, like even on that game that may just allow Benfica to qualify for the knockout stage of the Champions League. Real Madrid had gone one man down. The floodgates opened. Um, our goalie ended up scoring a goal in the very last minute with a header. Fine margins. Like, I mean, they could have, might as well have just gotten knocked out, because that would have saved us a few games down the year, to focus on other competitions we were more likely to win, right? So, if I look at the squad and the way it was rebuilt, again, Benfica always sells for numerous reasons. In this particular case, because Benfica qualified for the Champions League, Benfica didn't do as many sales as they usually do. That's why Neves ended up leaving the summer before, was because Benfica wasn't going to make it, so they had to make sales, right? So, in terms of sales, um, uh, Carreras obviously left to Madrid. We got another left back in return as part of that deal. Um, Artukoglu um, spent pretty much a year in Portugal before he was shipped back to Turkey. Artur Cabral, who was an absolute flop, ended up leaving. Tengsted had no room. He also left, and a few other players that were occupying spots in the squad, but were not necessarily going to be here for the long term. And then Kokshu, who probably hated by a lot of the fans, ended up going on a loan with, I think, a mandatory sale end of year, together with Di Maria, who finished his contract, right? So lots of departures, some sales along the way, but the biggest sale was Carreras, but not necessarily players that either were going to be hard to miss or you couldn't justify a sale. I think you could capitalize on those, right? Whether they should have been there since the beginning, well, that's a different story. But Benfica did well with the sales. With the incomings, um, when when I talked about like Sporting, all of Sporting, sorry, Benfica, Porto's acquisitions banging. I think for with Benfica it was a 50-50 draw. Sometimes good, sometimes shit, right? Let's start with the top signing. So Richard Rios, um, typical player that Mourinho actually likes. So I ended up working out. I think for his first season in Europe, Richard did okay, and then the second part of the season where he started scoring more goals, and I think he had his career record in terms of goals scored. He showed offensive numbers, but his duty was pretty much in midfield, run those hard yards, and with the press, with that engine that he has. I think it was successful. Whether like he was worth 27 million euros. Well, it depends. If you ended up selling him for 50, 60, a la Rui Costa, that's what he does, then you can claim it was successful. I think for the season, given everything that happened, he ended up being a net positive, I would say. Ivanovic, um, he was highly talented. He came in from the Swiss league. Completely different striker to what we're used to be having with Pavlidis. So I don't know if he's going to be sticking around for too long. I think there's room for him, but I don't think he had enough minutes to produce. We'll go through the stats because I think he ended up being the second or third highest scorer for Benfica. Um, Luca Bacchio, injuries along the way, a few hiccups in some games and some disagreements with Jose. I think for 20 million euros, he's not been good. Dedic and Dal have been consistent in defense. Sudakov, I think, has been probably the biggest flop of the season. There's a loan fee, but like with an actual acquisition after the summer, did not work out. Like we'll talk about it when I go through the squad again. Sydney was already shipped out. Rafa was just another loan that didn't make any sense. At Enzo for a loan fee plus a mandatory acquisition, I think. Um, I don't think was he on loan from Aston Villa. Anyways, I don't even know if he's going to be sticking here long term. I think good player. It's just that him and Richard Rios are too similar, right? So when I talked about the Benfica squad here, I think what was missing was that Sudakov in the center midfield, he did not adapt very well to both Portugal or to the league or in general, but also because nowadays it's very hard for a center attacking midfield to produce results like in today's football, especially if you play for Mourinho. Like it's just hard. So with two midfielders like Richard and Enzo behind him, who are not necessarily the most savvy when it comes to building up from the back. um, I would say Richard is a little bit more press resistant, but he doesn't necessarily have the ability today to execute the passes at the level that we would expect. I compare it, for example, with Enzo, who who now plays for Chelsea. Enzo's in first year for Benfica. He showed a much superior IQ when it came to ball progression and ball carrying, as well as passing, whether short or long passes, much higher than Richard. But Richard has more stamina and has probably more defensive aggressiveness. So there's other characteristics. That's why Jose likes him a lot. But neither Enzo Barrenechea or Richard Rios provided that glue between the defense and the offense. That's hard for center attacking midfielders or players that play up front are successful, right? Or makes them successful. It's just hard, right? And the same thing could be said about Rafa Silva when he came in mid-season for a loan. Um, it was hard for him to like execute well. A, because he's not at the level that he was. He's more even of a second striker rather than a center midfielder or center attacking midfielder. And like I said, with Mourinho's tactics, the idea is, can you provide a threat down the wings versus the middle, right? So overall, other than Dedic and Dal, who are now full-time Benfica players, who played well, and Araujo at the back, who was probably our best defender, um, most of the other acquisitions throughout the year didn't necessarily generate great results, right? Trubin is still shaky at the back, and then Pavlidis up front, Benfica's highest goal scorer, but uh, and that's kind of like where I wanted to shed some light. Is he's not just the best goal scorer; he's the best goal scorer for Benfica by a mile, right? And I think like that's like one of the reasons why it's pretty apparent that without Pavlidis scoring, Benfica was going to struggle um, to get points. Right, that was apparent throughout the season, but especially towards the second half when Pavlidis actually cooled down a little bit. So you can see the top scorers in the league. Suarez finished with 28, which is impressive because that was his first season in Portugal. He had high expectations. There were high expectations, sorry, with Gyökeres leaving the team, and yet he was able to produce an absurd amount of goals for the season. Pavlidis finished just right second, right? So with 22 goals. Having said that, the second highest goal scorer for Benfica ended up being Schlerdorf with 7 goals. 22 goals, and the next one was 7. And if you remember, I mentioned Ivanovic was probably the second or third best goal scorer. Well, Sidney Lopes Cabral, that was acquired from Estrela da Amadora halfway season, he ended up being tied with Ivanovic with 6 goals. So again, if we look at the acquisitions that they made, uh, Ivanovic, third or fourth best goal scorer, tied with Lopes Cabral, who we didn't even play half the season, yet he didn't have a fraction of the minutes that Pavlidis had. So with Sudakov being a flop, Luka Bacchio not delivering consistent performances or output, Ivanovic not playing enough minutes, that's a lot of money spent on players that didn't produce significant output, right? So again, bringing a coach throughout, like, early on in the season, the squad was not his. Mourinho did what he could, and he made Benfica tough to beat. But it was by no means a successful season. Like, don't let anybody say otherwise, right? The key is, could it have been avoided? And that's where, like, you know, not doing your due diligence, your homework during the summer, preparing the season, waiting for last minute just to make sure, oh, we qualify for the Champions League. And if things start going south, you sack the coach to then bring in Jose, who is on his way to Madrid. Maybe, who knows? Like, after I release this video, Madrid fans will probably know if Mourinho's joining them, right? Like with Florentino winning the elections. So we don't know. So it's next year is just going to be likely the continuation of the circus. And like that was a lot to share about Benfica. And like there's so much to go through. It's just that it's very hard to put everything into, one video. But if there's one thing you want to take away from this, given that the Portuguese league doesn't get a lot of coverage, especially online. So one of the reasons why I wanted to bring it up on this channel is to shed some light on topics of the Portuguese, and in particular Benfica, who I support, that are not talked about quite a bit. And I think people don't understand a how big of a miss this Portuguese project, this Benfica project, has been under Rui Costa, but how Rui Costa has year after year destroyed and deteriorated a club that was in the right direction for many years under Luis Felipe Vieira. Don't get me wrong; I'm not trying to argue whether one guy was better than the other, but year after year, we're seeing the results of mismanagement, right? And not even bringing someone like Mourinho is going to fix the issue, right? So um, I feel a little bit better talking about it, but I still don't feel good. So if I pull up the team of the season, because I'm done talking about Benfica for now. If I pull up the team of the season, that was voted by captains and coaches, if I'm not mistaken. This is official Liga de Portugal League of the season. There's not a single Benfica team player in it, and there shouldn't be, right? So Diego Costa at the back, of course. It should really have been the entire Porto defense, but I think like there was some injuries along the way, so like it did make sense. The second best option was obviously Maxi that played for Sporting, but you've got the two center backs, Bednarek and Kivior, who slotted, fit like a glove in that Farioli system, like I'm always saying. Alberto Costa, who was one of the best assisters in the whole league. I think he had, if I look at the assists, Alberto Costa had 8 assists. He was tied in. Oh, there was like a five players with 8 assists, all tied in third place. Alberto Costa is one of them, and I think is the only defender. So whether it was set pieces or crosses, kudos. So hats off. Well deserved in there. In the midfield, impossible to debate or to even argue against this. Hulman's obviously the DNA that Sporting had was pretty much a lot of it was due to his work. Froholt, who was, in my opinion, the best player of the season, the best young player, the best player overall, biggest surprise, 19 years old, showed so much composure, so much intelligence. Technically, he's no Xavi, he's no Iniesta, but these Nordic midfielders, they're starting to really um, let me put it, yeah, adapt very well in the Portuguese league. We saw Ausners that came in for Benfica, who has been a Swiss Army knife, but one of the most valuable players for Benfica over the last few years. He was a key element, a key member to Benfica winning the title under Roger Schmidt. So Hulman coming in and doing a perfect, almost perfect work in Sporting and winning titles along the way, and now Froholt, the latest Nordic, I think he's Danish, coming in and grabbing every opportunity that he had. It's really remarkable, especially at the age of 19. So testament to these Nordic players that are coming in. Really exciting to see. Clearly, this is work that was done behind the scenes up in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, of the academies. The fact that they can pump out players that are not just physically, stronger than the average, but also technically and from an IQ footballing perspective, they also can excel. So by no surprise that both of them are there. And then Rodrigo Salazar, who I believe has already been acquired by Sporting, another phenomenal season in Sporting Braga, 16 goals. Um, I th- Phenomenal player. Plays for Uruguay. I believe he plays in the national team. He will be at the World Cup for sure, if I'm not mistaken. He had stints in Germany at some point, but he really, settled in Braga about 3 years ago. And since joining Braga, he's been one of the best players in the league. I I wonder why he hasn't left. I know the Braga president; he's not necessarily an easy negotiator. So they were probably trying to find out, when would be the right time to sell him, and I think they just pulled the trigger. And I think even before the season ended, or even before the cup final, Salazar was sold to Sporting for 30 million euros. So great player, super excited to see him. Not excited to see him, you know, play for Sporting because he's like, Sporting is one of the biggest opponents, but excited to see him as a player evolved, and hopefully he gets a chance of a much bigger club outside of Portugal in a year or two. Um, Ricardo Horta, like on the left, like questionable. Like I'm not too sure how many other players were as consistent as Horta. Like I still think Schlerdup, even though Benfica had a bad season, I think like he showed enough that if it was between these two, bias aside, I'm not sure if I would have picked Horta over Schlerdup. But 14 goals for Ricardo Horta. Him and Salazar, like they scored half of Braga's goals throughout the year. So like, and Braga ended up finishing fourth. So it does make sense at the end of the day based on value and performance and output for him to make it there. And then Francisco Trincao, who usually plays center attacking midfielder, here they made a room for him on the right. Makes sense. Always a threat. He could go missing games here and there, but the consistency was pretty much there throughout the year. Like Sporting wouldn't have made it that far without him. And then the gunman, Luis Suarez up top with the 28 goals. He was by far the best striker. Something else I wanted to note is these strikers. So um, Suarez this year, Gyökeres the year before. In previous years, if I were to look at um, in previous seasons, because Gyökeres was the best goal scorer in 2 seasons straight. Um, be, like I have to go back to 2022, 2023 to see who were the best goal scorers. Like at the time, you had Gonzalo Ramos and Taremi. Um, there's there's a trend. There's definitely a trend that I can see, and even Darwin Nunez the year before. Um, the Portuguese league is pretty clear at this point. Sorry, I forgot to mention Samu for Porto. He tore his ACL during the season, but like the first half of the season, he was mashing work and scoring goals for Porto. Um, uh, I even forget how many goals he scored. Probably not important, or I would say not as important for my arguments. But for the season, how many goals? He had 13 goals. Yeah, Samu had 13 goals. Um, yeah, if I look at yeah, Samu finished eighth with 13 goals, and he missed almost half the season. Anyways, there's a trend in the Portuguese league, and that is that if you have a number 9 who is physically strong, who's fast, and who's got a good finish, chances are they're going to be very successful, right? Even Pavlidis for Benfica, he had a decent season with 22 goals. These strikers, they excel. And I think a lot of it is down to the fact that center backs in the Portuguese league, especially mid-table teams and lower table teams, are just weak. And what I mean by that is whether they can be caught on with the speed, or physically they just can't take on these strikers that come in with added quality. And it's been pretty clear that that's been successful, right? Now, will those strikers go on to other leagues and mash up work? That's the trend, is that not necessarily. So Darwin Nunez with Liverpool, not really. I mean, you can't translate the output he was doing in the Portuguese league with the output he did in Liverpool for many reasons, but it wasn't the same. Taremi, he left to Italy. Nobody talks about Taremi anymore. Victor Gyökeres did okay for Arsenal this season. So we'll see if that happens again the next season. Right? But like the trend is that these, again, physically impotent striker who can bully the defenders, who can drive through the channels and do the help with the build up. These strikers excel consistently in the Portuguese league. The question becomes, can they do it outside of the league? Right? So I think they can in the Portuguese league, but the center backs are usually weak in many regards. But I think otherwise is because like the level, the difference is just huge, right? So congrats to Luis Suarez for being the top goal scorer. Well deserved, 28 goals. Pretty successful season, especially being his first season um, in in the league, right? So that was a lot. We covered, uh, the big three teams, the standings, the formations. There's one more thing that I wanted to bring up, and that's like, in my opinion, three coaches, right? Three coaches from the bottom, the not outside of the top three. There's three coaches in particular that I wanted to talk about. Um, and like, they're interested of me because I like to look at surprises, coaches that did better than people expected, but also like coaches that don't necessarily get um, a spotlight, right? So there's three coaches here in particular that I wanted to talk about. So let me see, can I show them here next to me? Okay, why not? So Carlos Vincent on the left side. He took over Braga this year, actually about a year and a half ago. Um, he is a disciple of Pep. So he's part of the Pep school. So as some of you may or may not guess, he loves ball possession. He loves ball possession. Braga had the highest ball possession in the league, higher than Benfica, Porto, and Sporting. I think it was in the mid to high 60s. It's ridiculous. There were some games where, ball possession was in the 70s to even 80s, right? Sharp guy. Took a while for the players and even the fans to adapt to the system. Oh, of course, if I didn't mention Carlos Vicente, the Braga coach. Braga is the fourth biggest club in Portugal in terms of fans and sporting success. I would say, relatively speaking, over the last few years. Um, Even in Europe, like, they've had good runs in the either Europa League or Conference League. They did again. I think they reached the quarterfinals or even semis. I think it was quarterfinals. Um, so out of all the coaches outside of the top three, I'd say Carlos Vincent is probably the closest one that's ready for a new coaching opportunity, right? I wouldn't even be surprised if he's found elsewhere, because having worked for Pep and understanding the Pep system nowadays, that's very popular. I think for teams that are looking for ball possession, have players that are comfortable with the ball, Vincent has shown that, like, he can execute very well, right? Uh, he even took Braga to the League Cup final, not Taça de Portugal, but the League Cup final. They lost against Guimarães, but they beat Benfica and other teams along the way for most of the season. So, like, he's shown that he can um, play up against the best teams, especially in the cup games. It's just that they had a shit ton of injuries this year. So, like, they ended up finishing with 59 points at fourth position. But in the Portuguese league, if you're not the top three teams, you usually don't get a chance. So, someone to look out for. I would definitely welcome Vincent to Benfica. So if you're interested, Vincent, please consider. Please consider. It's just, the question is whether there's a project for you that's organized by Rui Costa. I'm not sure. Um, Second in line here is Cesar Peixoto. Some of you may recognize him. He played for Porto and Benfica, to name a few clubs. He's been coaching in Portugal for quite a while. He's been around, and I wouldn't say he's had a successful career as a coach. He's moved quite a bit. Uh, Usually 1 year or so, not more than that. However, he coached Gil Vicente this year, or he's been coaching Gil Vicente since the 2025, the previous season. Um, he took over halfway. They ended up finishing sixth, which is pretty good in the Portuguese league, considering they had a very small budget. And Cesar, what's interesting about Cesar is, just like Carlos Vincent and the third coach that I'm going to talk about, um, Cesar Pessoto actually describes the game very well in press conferences. He describes how his team played. He doesn't sugarcoat things, and his team likes to play offensive football. Um, the players are comfortable with the ball. They're not shy when they set up games like against the big clubs. Even when they go and play away, they're not parking the bus. They're coming to win. They're coming to play, and obviously lack of quality. Eventually, you ended up losing, but it showed a coach that's brave, and it shows players that want to rally up behind a coach, and that's personally what I like to see is when players are not just playing for the badge, but they're playing for the guy that's making the calls. So Cesar did very well for Gil Vicente this year. Um, Promising a career, I would say, even though he's been around for a few years now. But the last year, especially with the Gil Vicente project, after losing a few players, they lost one player to West Ham at in the winter um, transfer market. So in the January transfer market. So I see him also as an up and coming coach. If Farioli ends up being picked up by a bigger team in Europe, I wouldn't be surprised if Villas Boas comes and fetches Cesar. Cesar played for Porto. I believe he played for Jose. He was part of those big teams or around those 2010s and slightly earlier teams for Porto. Great job there. And last but not least, and again, I'm pretty sure very few of you have, if you don't follow the Portuguese league, you haven't even heard of these coaches. But I am pretty sure you're going to hear at least about one of these three in the next few years. Um, Ian Castro. So Ian Castro has been coaching Estoril for a few years now. Let me double check. He's been there since 2024. Uh, he's Scottish. Ian Castro is Scottish, and yet he speaks Portuguese fluently. Press conferences, flash interviews, post game reactions. I couldn't believe it. The first time I heard him on the radio, um, I hadn't heard his name yet. They were saying we're interviewing the Strudel coach, and they said Ian Castro. I'm like, whatever. And then he was speaking no problem. And then later on, I looked him up. I'm like, oh my god, this guy is Scottish. Ian, first of all, it's not because he speaks Portuguese that I want to talk about him. Um, but like, first of all, having a foreign manager come in to a league and then slowly with time in the space of 2 years be able to speak fluently, that shows commitment, right? Like that's the first thing. The second thing is Studio Playa is one of the smallest. And when mean smallest, I mean one of the smallest clubs in the top flight in Portugal, both by stadium size as well as by um, budget, right? And Ian Castro's team, just like Gil Vicente under Cesar Peixoto, they like to play offensive football. And he likes to make use of his creative players. So they've had a few set of players that have played in the Portuguese league for quite a few years now, and they've been consistent. So one of them being Begraoui. Begraoui is the forward that plays for Estoril. He was um, one of the top scorers in the league, if I'm not mistaken. Let me look it up here. I lost the tab. Begraoui, forward for Estoril Praia, finished the league with 20 goals. So um, for a team the size of Estoril Praia, and again, Estoril finished 10th in the division. Given um, the size of the club, it's still very impressive. They finished the league with the fourth best attack, or sorry, fifth best attack. After the big three in Braga, Estoril scored the most goals. It's just that they conceded a shit ton because they just don't have the quality, or perhaps the setup required to concede less. But that's because they're very aggressive going forward, and I like that. I like players that are brave. I like coaches that are brave. Players as well, but in particular coaches that are brave and they're not scared of going for it. Especially when you have less budget, especially when you have players of lower quality, especially when you don't have the squad depth that allows you to handle both, whether it's a cup runs and leagues. Um, it's just not feasible. And yet he was able to get what he could out of the team. So very impressive. especially again, like he speaks Portuguese very fluently. But if there's one thing about these coaches that I have in common is that they all have their own style of play. I don't watch I didn't watch all their games, and I also don't like have enough intel specifically. Carlos Vince is a little bit more, but like I've seen their games and I've seen enough to share with you guys and to tell you that there are good coaches in the Portuguese league. Especially when I look at you, Benfica and Rui Costa, you don't have to go abroad, whether you want Marco Silva or someone else. You don't necessarily have to go abroad to find talent. Like there's definitely talent in the Portuguese league, and these three guys have been mashing up work. Obviously, expectations, they're not going to be winning titles, like unless they pull up, something magical, like Leicester City did a few years ago for the Premier League. But they're they set up their teams to play. They set up the teams to play and win games, right? And if you're like a big club like Benfica, um, that should be what you should be doing. So that was a lot. I'm tired. It's getting really late. I hope you guys liked it. It's already 1 hour and 15 minutes. I always forget to say this, but if you like the content, please like and subscribe. I'm still getting used to all of this shit. The microphone, I think it's getting better. The camera, I think, is set up okay. Screen sharing, all of this is just me and StreamYard. But I do enjoy talking about it, and I hope that this is one of many videos that I'll make about the Portuguese league. So, like I said, on your way out, please like and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.